Good evening. This is Pastor Barbara, aka Preacher with Parrots. Today is December 14th, 2016, almost Christmas. I don't have a live group at the moment. When I began our Bible study this evening, I started using the computer I usually use to broadcast with. And when I went to set up the one I record with, things weren't working. I finally could not get the other computer to work at all. I think I know what to do with it, but it would have taken 10 or 15, 20 minutes. And I didn't want my group sitting around while I tried something out that wasn't even a sure thing. So we just did our class. This is just a quick follow-up. Take much less time because I don't intend to do any or very much reading tonight. But I had prepared this chart. I think it's important that I show you a bunch of things that I want to show you all on the same night. There are some things about what goes around comes around and so forth that I want to mention. Last week, we ended right after Sarah had died. Abraham married Keturah, had a lot of children with her, finally died. He had negotiated with the people around what we now call Hebron for the cave that I described to you, at least the way it was in 1967, right after the Six-Day War, when I was there. I want to talk to you about Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob, whose name is also Israel, and Rachel. This last part we haven't got to in our scripture reading yet. Many of the things that we see here, we see here, we see here. Many of the promises that we see here, we see here, we see here. Abraham, because Sarah was barren. Now, when they finally have Isaac, he marries a woman who is barren. But the result of her barrenness is twice what it was for Abraham and Sarah. Sarah had a servant. Any child born of the servant would legally be hers. Just like when my birds have babies, I can sell them. They're mine because the parents were mine, so the babies are mine. And Sarah used this logic, which is not good logic, to say to Abraham, have a child with her. And he did. And Ishmael was born. Ishmael, the mother or the servant of Sarah, was an Egyptian. So Ishmael, the offspring of Abraham and an Egyptian woman, is an Arab. God had specifically told Sarah later, he is not the one that I made the promise to, that your offspring will be as the stars of the sky and the sands of the sea, etc. So then, when Sarah is 90 and Abraham is 100, Isaac is born. There are problems between these two and their mothers. And Sarah's maid and her child Ishmael leave. Let's now go to Isaac and Rebekah. That was our lesson last Wednesday. Abraham, remember, he had I'm going to call him a head servant. He had many servants. But because he had no offspring, he was prepared early on to leave everything he had to his servant. But of course now he has children. He has Isaac and Ishmael. When when Abraham finally dies, his two sons, the one who is, I'm going to use the term Jewish because it has meaning for us at this time. It was not a word yet, but I'm going to use the word Jewish. Abraham had a son who was Jewish and a son who was Arab. When Abraham died, he was buried in the tomb that he had negotiated with the people of the area of Hebron, and is buried there. And his two sons buried him. We have a brief discussion. Let me tell you where it is. Regarding the offspring of Ishmael. And that was last week. Abraham, when he realized he's getting old, he takes this servant that he cares for enough to have gifted him everything he owned for lack of having children to leave anything to. He takes this same servant that he has this much confidence in and says, go find a suitable wife for my son. Now, the same covenant that God made with Abraham about the father of a great nation, as numerous as the stars of the sky, the sands of the sea, etc., he makes this same covenant, legal arrangement, repeats it to Isaac. He wants Isaac to have the right woman, and so he gets his servant, and that was our lesson last week. He takes 10 camels. He's on his way. He's praying when he gets to Haran, Lord, I don't know which one, and I have the responsibility of finding the right spouse for my master's son. Whoever it is, Lord, because I'm going to ask every woman for a drink at the well. Lord, the one that says, I'll not only give you a drink, but I'll give to drink to your 10 camels. If she's the one, let her say that. And of course, that happened. Excuse me, got to get some of my red water. Rebecca comes to the servant of Abraham and says, not only will I draw water for you, but I will draw water for your 10 camels. He asks her, is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night? Now, she's a woman. She can't invite people on behalf of the family and so forth, but her brother shows up. And he says, oh, yes, she knew that there was room, but she doesn't extend the invitation. But the brother comes, and he does. The servant, wanting to complete the deal he was working on when he came there, before he can sit down and eat, he says, I have to tell you why I'm here. I'm the servant of Abraham. I was to come and find from this family a suitable wife for Isaac. I believe I found her. Can we leave tomorrow? You will remember that Isaac, as the servant and Rebecca are approaching the property, he's walking around and he sees her from a distance. She sees him from a distance and covers herself with a veil. Now, it's this same cultural habit, custom, that we still follow to a degree today, although women can see through the veil that they're wearing with their wedding dress, and people can see their faces, still they're veiled. Until the minister says, by the authority invested in me in the state of California, I now pronounce you husband and wife. He hadn't seen her, he didn't pick her. But Abraham, Sarah had died. Abraham realized it was time to find a spouse for Isaac. And even though he didn't pick her, he loved her so much, he was comforted in his grief for his deceased mother, Sarah. There is great love between these two. Not a marriage of convenience. It was a matter according to God's will, but it happened to be a marriage of great physical attraction and loving and caring. Isaac and Rebekah faced a situation that Abraham, Sarah, and Lot had faced before when there was a famine. They go to the land of the Philistines. Remember when Abraham and Sarah went to Egypt? Now, we know that Sarah and Abraham were half brother and sister. They had the same father. They had different mothers. So when Abraham, having a beautiful wife, wanting to become even wealthier and be liked and respected by the people, tells the king, she's my sister. Then God, when we got to this before, you'll remember I brought out several translations and versions. because of what later happens to Isaac is so similar to what happened to Abraham. Now, Isaac and Rebekah go before the king, and Isaac says, I have a beautiful wife. He didn't pick her, he loved her. And I told this to the king. In the case of Abraham and Sarah, God tells the king, do you know that one of the women in your house is married? And you could sin without knowing it because you don't know she's married. And she is now one of the women in your house. Isaac does not tell Abimelech that Rebekah is his wife. They pass her off as a sister. At least with Abraham, it's a half lie because she is a spouse, but she is a sister. In the case of Isaac and Rebekah, there's no relationship here. She's not a sister. So then how does Abimelech know? Well, he's looking out his window and he sees signs of the affection between Isaac and Rebekah. And he calls him and he says, what's going on? We could have sinned unknowingly because of what we didn't know. Well, deception just goes on and on and on and on. Rebekah is also barren. Now, when Sarah was barren, she tells her husband, take my servant, have a child with her. When Rebekah is barren, Isaac prays for her. She goes from being unable to have children to being pregnant with 2 children, twins. God doesn't describe it as 2 sons or 2 children. He describes it as 2 nations. He says, I should have marked it so that I could find it real fast for you. Rebekah is pregnant with Esau and Jacob. Now, because this is natural childbirth and not surgical intervention, where possibly the surgeon might pick who goes first, the first one out is Esau. After him comes Jacob. And Jacob has a hold of his brother's foot. And Esau, the firstborn, is born first, and Jacob is born later. He said, but I thought this was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Are you saying this is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Esau? Well, we have 2 things, 2 interventions. when they're kids. Now, it sort of bothers me that Isaac and Rebekah loved each other so much and respected each other so much until it came to their favorites. Esau was what in today's world we would say a man's man. Now, I know it's not appropriate to assign certain jobs. A week ago, yesterday, I had a new generator put in my pacemaker. And I was talking to the RN, a man, who was writing things down and preparing me to go in that freezing cold operating room. And I commented on the fact. I said, in the 40s, I worked as a nurse in the 40s and early 1950. I said, there were no male nurses. I said, as a matter of fact, there were no male telephone operators. And I said, we had an orderly. But I said, even we, the women nurses, did the surgical preps. And orderlies were only used for one purpose. And I was kind of chatting. And it's not appropriate today to assign certain things to men and certain things to women. Unless, of course, it's in major sports or competitive sports where the physique of a woman is generally not that of the physique of a male and doesn't provide the same abilities and qualities for competing physically. But Esau was, I don't want to say mama's boy, but he was quiet, liked to stay at home. And Jacob, he was a hunter. So who do you think Isaac liked more? And who do you think Rebekah liked more? Now, when Esau and Jacob were younger, Jacob, I was going to say Esau, was out hunting. And he comes home and he's starved, and his brother, perhaps I should refer to him as a chef, had just prepared some stew. And Esau said, oh, I want that stew. He said, I'll even give you my birthright. Ishmael has something that Isaac didn't even have. They were both sons of Abraham. But Ishmael did not have a Jewish mama. And you know that's what makes a Jew a Jew. Perhaps it's because you don't always know before DNA who the daddy is. But you always know who the mama is. But this being the firstborn, the privilege, the name, the property, the job status that goes with being the firstborn male over the secondborn and so forth. Ishmael is the firstborn of Abraham. But he is not the chosen son for whom and for the positions and the blessings and the future history that God has in mind for Abraham's son. But here with Isaac, there was no problem. But with Jacob and Esau, we come to this situation. The father, well, let me get back to that bowl of stew. Esau says, I will give my birthright for something to eat right now. Because if I don't eat right now, I'm going to die. And what good is it to be the oldest one, the firstborn, have the gifts and the privileges of the firstborn if I'm dead? And if I don't eat right now, I'll die. And as youngsters, as young men, between the two of them, not their parents, not anybody else, just between the two of them, that birthright is exchanged for a bowl of stew. But it is not the agreement of two young men. In the eyes of the culture and the eyes of God, it is the Father's blessing. Back in the days of Noah, we studied recently an occasion in which a grandson was cursed for something a son had done. Why? Because the son had been blessed. And the blessing and the blessings of the blessing cannot be taken away once they're given. All right, so we go on from there. Now that Jacob is getting old, he realizes it's getting time to bless his firstborn. And he likes his firstborn. He's a man's man. He's a hunter. As opposed to Jacob, who liked being around the house, helping out his mom, etc. Jacob says to his firstborn son, Esau, I want you to go out. I want you to take your bow, your arrow, take everything. I want you to kill me a good animal. And I want you to cook it up for me just like I like things, so that I can then give you my blessing, because I'm old. I could die at any time. And Rebecca is hearing the conversation. Rebecca goes to her favorite, says, go out in the yard, get 2 goats. I'm going to fix those goats to look and taste like the best venison your papa has ever eaten. Now he's blind. He won't know that he's giving the blessing to you. And Jacob says, but my brother's hairy. The Holman Christian Standard Bible says when he was born, he was reddish. And he looked like he was wearing a fur coat. He was hairy. He said, when I approach my father, I won't smell like my brother. I won't feel. If he reaches out and touches my arm, my hand, he'll know I'm not my brother. And Rebecca says, that's okay. I'll take the skin of the 2 goats and I'll put skin around your hands and arms and around your shoulders where he's going to reach around and take hold of you. And that's how the blessing of the firstborn went to Jacob, the secondborn. The thing they did between themselves when they were younger, that's one thing. But the blessing when given, now this, we're under grace. Before grace was the law of Moses. But we're not even with the people in Egypt needing to be taken out of Egypt and their slavery. So we're quite a ways from being there. Now, said and done. Because the goats didn't have to be hunted out. So that was preparing their meat and getting everything ready. That was quick. Isaac did not hear Esau's voice when he talked to Jacob. He said, "Who are you?" And Jacob said, "I'm Esau, your firstborn son." Liar. But then, where did it come from? Isaac saying, "She's my sister." Sarah saying, "Oh, well, she's my handmaid. Legally, her child is mine." Where did it come from? So now, Jacob receives Esau's blessing. Now, Esau says, "I'm going to get him. I'm going to kill him." Rebekah says to Jacob, "You better get out of here. Give it some time. He'll get over it, but get out of here now." Jacob, on directions from his mother Rebekah, Jacob is told, "Go to the house of your father's father, of your father's brother, and marry one of his daughters." That means go to your uncle's house. Your father's brother is your uncle, and marry one of his daughters, your cousin. So Jacob goes to the house of his uncle, Laban. He's the one that when Abraham's servant saw Rebekah and said, "Is there room in our house?" And she says there's room, but she couldn't do the invitation. But there was Laban. Now, it's at his home that Jacob goes, Uncle Laban's home. And he works for him. He's going to spend some time there. He's got to escape from his brother who's hunting him down to kill him. And his uncle says, "It's not right. You're working here. You're living in my home. You're working here. But just because you're a relative, you shouldn't be working without being paid. What would you like me to pay you?" Well, when Rebekah said, "Go to your uncle Laban's house," she knows that this line must be kept. And that's why she sends him there. So Jacob says, well, the time I've been here isn't really anything I really need, but I noticed you've got 2 daughters. And I kind of like the youngest one. Can I have her? Now, he who lied to his father and pulled a fast one on his twin brother now gets the same thing happening to him. And Uncle Laban says, sure, you can have her. And they have a wedding at night with no lights on. And in the morning he said, who in the world are you? You look like the older sister. And when they talked to Uncle Laban, he says, well, and I will tell you that in some cultures, and even I have met a couple families, not many, and I'm old, so it's been a long time, but there's kind of almost a custom that the oldest girl should get married first. And when the oldest one is 20, 25, God forbid 30, and not married, her younger sisters start to get concerned. Would you please get married so that we can get married? And that was what was pulled on Jacob. Now, Jacob had 12 children. Who did Jacob love? Now, his name becomes Israel later. Who did Jacob love with all of his heart and worked 7 years for? For Rachel. And then there was the older sister. And then there were their 2 maids. So there were 4 that were supplying Jacob with children. Out of the 12 children that Jacob or Israel has, the 11th one is the one we're interested in. He's the one who is sold by his 10 older brothers, the oldest of which should be looking out for him and tried to, and this is future study, but I want you to see how all this conniving, finding another way to get something done, to get what you want. When Jacob is on the way to Uncle Laban's house, he's out in the middle of nowhere, and the sun goes down. It's dark. And he sleeps out in the middle of nowhere. And he doesn't have a pillow, and he puts a stone under his head. And he has a dream that angels are coming up and down on a ladder between here and heaven. And God reveals certain things to him. And in the morning, he takes this stone and he plants it like a gravestone or like any memorial stone. This is where such and such happened. God gives him certain promises. Going to be with you, going to bless you. And the name of the place is Bethel. You ever heard of Bethel Baptist Church, Bethel Nazarene Church, Bethel Presbyterian Church? Very popular name to name a church because it means God was here. God spoke to me here. It was the 11th child, Joseph, that becomes, first of all, the first child of Rachel, the one he fell in love with. But he has 10 children before Joseph is born. And then after he's sold into slavery and he comes into face to face with his 10 older brothers, and they find out who he is. They have no clue who he is. These 10 of these 12 have sold him into slavery. And they're in another country, in Egypt. And they are talking to the second most important person in all of Egypt. How do they know it's a brother? But I just wanted you to see all of this as one. That's why some of this is still future. This we studied a long time ago. This we studied last week, and some of it tonight. I wanted you to see what goes around comes around. And yet, God promised Jacob, Israel, he would bless him. Ishmael and Esau, the two guys that were firstborn, but were not God's choices. But they were the firstborn. They got together and made all kinds of trouble for some of Abraham's offspring. I'm going to close. I didn't intend for this to take very long, but I wanted you to see this as a whole and how each one handled. First of all, we got two here. We're dealing with somebody that's barren. We've got two committing the same sin of not introducing a wife as a wife. And yet, we have the great nation of Israel and the promises that God made to them when Jacob is sleeping on that stone. Jacob is sleeping on a stone in a country where he's a visitor. Oh, that country's going to belong to Israel, but it doesn't yet. Doesn't even belong to them yet. He's out there on somebody else's property sleeping on a stone. And God says, I'll bring you all back together from far away. I want you to think 1948, I was 17 and a sophomore in Bible college. Happened to be the same year that I was called to preach. How far have we come since him sleeping out on a stone? dreaming of angels going up and down on a ladder. Well, we'll see you next week when we continue with Jacob and his eventual getting to his uncle's house and seeing Rachel and falling in love with her, and the 12 tribes or the 12 sons of Israel. Until next week, God bless you.